Simplifying Biomechanics.
Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel Simplifying Biomechanics. So in today's lecture we will try to understand different types of joints in our skeletal system. So let us start with the types of joint. So what is skeletal system? So everybody knows what is skeletal system. Skeletal system of the human body consists of bones and then there are joints. So when two bones come in contact with each other, the interface formed is known as joint, right? So we are going to study different types of joint, right? So let us try to understand different types of joint, right? So based on the structure, we have three categories of joint. The fibrous joint, which is also known as synovial joint. Then we have the cartilaginous joint. The other name of the cartilaginous joint is the amphiarthrodial joint. Then we have the synovial joint. The other name of the synovial joint is diarthrodial joint. Right? So let us understand how, based on the structure, these joints are classified. So as I told you, joints form when two bones comes in contact with each other. So based on the interface structure, these joints are classified, right? So in the fibrous joint, two bones comes in very close to each other, and between the bones there is a material known as fibrous connective tissues, and fibrous connective tissues is made up of collagen, right? So in this category of joint, between the bones, what kind of material do you have? You have the material which is known as fibrous connective tissues, right? Which is nothing but collagen, right? Whereas in the cartilaginous joint, again the two bones are in very much proximity to each other, and the material between the bones is the cartilage, right? Now the collagen is more stiffer than the cartilage, right? So just remember that collagen is more stiffer than the cartilage. Coming to the synovial joint, now the synovial joint is a bit different from these two joints, because in the synovial joint you have quite good amount of gap, or you have good amount of space between the bones, and within that space a kind of a material that is there is known as synovial fluid, which is basically a very flexible material and act as a lubricant that helps in the movement of the bones against each other, right? So in the synovial joint category, what you have a formation of gap, and the gap we can call gap as a cavity, right? So here the cavity is formed, and within the cavity what you have a synovial fluid, right, which is a lubricant, which act as a lubricant, right, and helps in the movement of the joint. So let us again look at these three categories. So in the fibrous joint, since between the bones you have a collagen, which is stiffer material, I told you, so there is no movement between the bones, right? So what you can say, in the fibrous joint there is no movement, just two bones comes in contact with each other, but there is no movement, so no movement. Coming to the cartilaginous joint, I told you that between the bones there is a material known as cartilage. Cartilage is less stiffer than the collagen, so there is little bit of movement between the bones. So you can say that there is little movement, right? Coming to the synovial joint allow two bones to be separated by a cavity, and within that cavity you have a synovial fluid which acts as a lubricant. So there is a high mobility that this joint allows. So this joint is freely movable. You can say this joint is freely movable. Okay, so I hope now you have understood different types of joint based on the structure. Fibrous joint, which allow no movement at all; cartilaginous joint, which allow little movement; synovial joint, which allow free movement. Now let us understand where these joints are present in the human skeletal system. So the classical example of the fibrous joint is the joint between the flat bones of the skull. So you have a skull here, and you know that skull is made up of different flat bones. So you have the frontal bone here, you have the parietal bone, then you have the occipital bone, right? And you have the temporal bone. So the joint between these flat bones comes under which category? Fibrous joint, because the movement between these bones is almost zero, right? Because you can observe your skull, there is no movement between the bones. So the joint between these bones comes under the category of the fibrous joint, right? So this is the example of the fibrous joint. Example of the cartilaginous joint. So I'm showing here a part of your vertebral column. So the cartilaginous joint is the joint between the two vertebrae of the vertebral column, right? So between the two vertebrae there is a cartilage, and since there is a cartilage which is less stiffer than the collagen, so there is a little bit of movement between the vertebrae, right? So in your human skeletal system, you have stacks of vertebrae in the vertebral column. So when you bend, right, when you bend your spine, these stack of vertebrae allow movement because there is a little movement in each of the vertebrae. So collectively it allows the movement of your trunk, right? So this is the example of the cartilaginous joint. The other example of the cartilaginous joint is the joint between the pubis bone of the pelvic girdle. So the joint formed between the left and the right pubis, which is here, comes under the category of the cartilaginous joint. Now coming to the classical example of the synovial joint. So synovial joint classical example is the knee joint. So you have a femur here, you have tibia, and this is a cavity between the femur and the tibia, right? And this cavity is filled with, I told you, a fluid which acts as a lubricant, and the fluid is synovial fluid, right? So since this synovial fluid is acting as a lubricant, so the femur can move with respect to the tibia very freely, right? So this is the example of the synovial joint. Since synovial joint is the most abundant joint in the human skeletal system, right? So it is very important to focus on the synovial joint, because synovial joint is the joint that allow the movement or the flexibility to the skeletal system, right? So let us further classify the synovial joint. So synovial joint can be classified based on the movement they allow or based on their function. So we have 6 categories of the synovial joint. So we will see these joints one by one. So the first joint is the ball and socket joint, right? So this joint is the ball and socket joint, right? Then we have the saddle joint. Then we have something called as ellipsoidal joint, or sometimes it is also called as condyloid joint. Then we have the hinge joint. Then we have the pivot joint. And lastly, we have something called as plane joint, right? So let us see what are these joints actually. So the ball and socket, as the name suggests, you have a ball and you have a socket. So the top part provides the socket. So these are the two bones. The top bone provides the socket, right? And the bottom bone provides the ball, right? So it is something like this. So you have a socket, which is a part of one bone, and then you have a ball, which is a part of another bone. So the socket and the ball comes together, and basically balls fit into the socket. So now the ball can move in all the 3 planes, right? So ball can move axially, ball can move in this direction, and ball can move in this direction. So in all the 3 planes, the ball can move. That means this ball and socket synovial joint allows the movement in all the 3 planes. That means it has 3 degrees of freedom. 3 degrees of freedom. So what is degree of freedom? Degree of freedom is the number of independent motion a joint can allow. So it can allow 3 independent motion in 3 different planes. Coming to the saddle joint. So saddle joint can only allow 2 degrees of freedom. It cannot allow the axial rotation, right? So saddle joint is something like this. You can consider one part of the bone, the end part of one bone, something like this, and the other bone something like this. So they are, logged something like this. So they can move in this direction, they can move in this direction, but they can rotate axially. So that means they allow only 2 degrees of freedom. Coming to the ellipsoidal joint. So ellipsoidal joint is very similar to the ball and socket joint, except the socket in the ball and socket is circular in shape, whereas in the ellipsoidal joint, the socket is in elliptical shape, right? So now you can tell me, if the socket and the ball is in elliptical shape, then obviously there will not be any axial rotation of the ball within the socket, but it can allow other 2 movements. So this will have again 2 degrees of freedom, right? Coming to the hinge joint, so hinge joint is the most relatable and the common joint present in the skeletal system. So the common presence of the hinge joint you can think of in the doors. So you have a door where one end of the door is fixed to the wall, and that end of the door is fixed to the wall using the hinge joint. So hinge joint is basically, allow motion in 1 degree of freedom, right? Coming to the pivot joint, so pivot joint allow motion only in the axial direction. So you have something, a hollow kind of a structure in one bone, and then there is a ball kind of a structure on the other bone, and they can only rotate axially. They cannot do other motion in other two planes, right? So again, the pivot joint can have 1 degree of freedom, right, which is only the axial rotation. Now coming to the last joint, which is a plane joint. So in the plane joint you have bones which basically have a structure that is a flat in nature, which is a flat kind of a structure. Now coming to the last joint, which is a plane joint. So in the plane joint you have bone that are flat in nature, and the top bone slides over the bottom bone, and they can slide in 2 directions. The top bone can slide in this direction, and it can slide in this direction over the bottom bone. So it can allow 2 degrees of freedom, and this is the only joint in the human skeletal system that allows translational movement. It does not allow the rotational movement, right? So it can allow 2 degrees of movement, right? Now let us see where these joints can be found in the skeletal system, right? So the hip joint and the shoulder joint is the example of the ball and socket joint. So this is a hip joint, the enlarged view of the hip joint. So you can see this is a hip joint, and this is your femur bone, right? And this is your pelvic girdle. So pelvic girdle basically provides the cavity, and the femur bone provides the ball. So this is a ball and this is a cavity. And when these two bones comes in contact with each other, they form a joint which is ball and socket joint. The same thing happens at the shoulder joint. So your shoulder girdle, which is made up of clavicle and the scapula, forms a cavity, and your humerus bone basically provides the ball. And this ball and socket joint is formed in the shoulder joint, at the shoulder, right? Now coming to the example of the saddle joint. So the saddle joint is found between the carpals. So these are the carpals bone and the metacarpals, right? And the same thing happens at the foot, the joint between the tarsals and the metatarsals. So these joints are basically the example of the saddle joint. Coming to the ellipsoidal joint. So ellipsoidal joint are the joint which is formed between the metacarpals and the phalanges. In the foot, metatarsals and the phalanges. Coming to the hinge joint, so hinge joint, classical example of the hinge joint is the knee joint and the elbow joint, right? Coming to the pivot joint, so classical example of the pivot joint is the joint that is made between the C1 and the C2 cervical vertebra. So what happens when you basically move your or rotate your skull? So this skull is rotated based on the pivot joint, right? So what happens here, your skull basically sits on the C1 vertebra, which is known as atlas, and C2 vertebra is known as axis. So the skull and the C1 together rotates over the C2 vertebra. So they basically forms what is known as atlantoaxial joint, right? And they can, so C1 can rotate over the C2, right? So this movement of your head comes under the category of pivot joint. Coming to the flat joint, or also known as the plane joint. So the example of the plane joint is the joint between the carpals and the tarsals bone, right? So you have these small bones which are present at your wrist, which is a carpal bones. So the joint between these carpal bones comes under the category of the plane joint, right? So thank you for watching this video. I hope to see you in the next lecture.